We've had a lot of rain. Is it starting to rain? Yeah, we're going to get a little bit. I don't know if anybody has a testimony this morning. You know, testimonies usually are things about answered prayers, things that God has done for you, met your needs, given you answers and guidance. I remember when I was young, probably 7 or 8 years old, I think it was a Sunday night or a Wednesday night at church, and testimony service, and a gentleman stood up. He was an older gentleman. Seemed really old to me at that time, but still, I think he was probably his 70s or 80s. And he stood up and he recited a psalm, and I remember that. I really impressed by that. It wasn't a quick psalm either. You know, like Psalm 117 has 2 verses. Or it wasn't Psalm 123, one that a lot of people know. It was like, 87 or something. So, memorization is neat. I don't know if you practice that, or I know we've taught children to memorize certain verses. It's nice to have a list that you read or that you remember. Like that song we were singing at Vacation Bible School, thy word have I hid in my heart. So today we're going back to the 10 Commandments. And it's odd to consider a subject that everybody knows about. When I started looking at the 10 Commandments for a lesson purposes, who doesn't know what the 10 Commandments are? But it's interesting to look at them closely. They're found in 2 places, in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. The first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. The second commandment, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. And God went on to say, you're not to bow down, and it seems an image for the purpose of worship, for bowing down or serving. The last one we looked at was the 3rd Psalm, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. God's name is to be revered. It's to be reverenced. It's to be honored. We don't use God's name lightly. We're looking today at the 4th commandment. It's the first one that I would call a positive command. There are 8 of them that thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. And that's what people normally think of, I think, is commandments, at least people who are not saved. God says, oh, don't do this, don't do that. But that's not all that he said. He says there are some things we should do positively. So let's look at Exodus chapter 20. And we're going to look at verses 8 through 11. And verse 8 tells us, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Were you brought up where Sunday was a holy day? I mean, it has a holy purpose. It's a day of worship. That's the thing that really struck me as I read about the 7th day, the Sabbath day, and the commandment, it says to keep it holy, and it's not something we see repeated in the New Testament. Is kind of the feeling I have, and I'll talk about that in this lesson. But it's a positive command. As we read on verses 9 through 11, it says, 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. And it's interesting that it says the 7th day is the Sabbath, because I've always thought of Sabbath meant 7th. And it's related to the word, but it doesn't really mean 7th. Sabbath does not mean 7th. It means rest. The 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, thy maidservant, cattle, nor thy stranger that's within thy gates. Even foreigners who have become residents in your country, they are not to be permitted to work as well. It's a time off from work. No work is to be done. Who is not mentioned in this list? If we would ask our pastor, does he work on the Sabbath? Well, the Levites were not mentioned. The priests were not mentioned. There was work that they did on the Sabbath, right? Because there was worship. There were sacrifices being done. So there is some understanding to what the commandment is. Sunday school teachers, evangelists that travel, and their ministry is largely centered on the Sabbath day. So look at verse 11 again. Or did we read that far? No, we didn't. So look at verse 11. It says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and then rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it." Verse 11 emphasizes a pattern that God established in Genesis chapter 2. I want to turn there as well. Genesis chapter 2. And we see chapter 2 is a refocus of the creation of mankind. Man is created on day 6, mentioned in chapter 1. And then chapter 2 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made. And he rested on the seventh day." Now, did God have to rest? He doesn't need rest. But his work that he wanted to accomplish was completed in 6 days. So the work ceased. And that's really what Sabbath means. It means it's a cessation of work. So on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. It was done. It was completed. And verse 3 says, "And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it." So it's important, and it's set apart. It's been, how long have we had a 7-day week? It's been eternal or consistent and constant in all of mankind's history of a 7-day week. God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. He rested. It's the pattern that he's given to us. You might know that the Seventh-day Adventists believe that the day of worship should continue to be on Saturday, on the seventh day of the week. And we'll look at that. In fact, I probably mentioned, pardon me? The Jews? Yeah, they worship on Saturday. Yep. And it is the seventh, it is, in a sense, it is the seventh day of the week. But we'll see what occurred in the New Testament in a minute. But when I was a meter reader years ago, I had a lady on my route who would engage me in conversation sometimes. We talked about church, and she talked about her church, and she was a Seventh-day Adventist. And she gave me like a 1-year subscription to their magazine, which was really interesting. I wish I had kept them, because they had a whole series on how they picture the book of Revelation. They believe, and I don't know, I tried to look it up today, see if they consistently believe the same thing, that Sabbath day, you had to worship on the seventh, on Saturday, or you weren't obeying God. They believed, at least the articles at that time, they believe what? They still do, okay. That the mark of the beast is to worship on Sunday. That's outrageous. People can interpret a lot of things differently. I know Go to Revelation chapter 9, verse 10, please. Their view of the book of Revelation is it's all historical. It's all the curses and the violence and the destruction. They believe it's all historical, and they interpret this verse specifically about these creatures that had tails like scorpions. There were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men for 5 months. They said that's like a B-52 bomber with a tail gunner. You know, you have the machine gun in the tail. That's the sting in the tail. So people can take a lot of freedom, a lot of liberties with what God says. But the seventh day, yeah. What is interesting to me is that Sabbath does not mean seventh, but it does mean a cessation from work. You ever heard about a professor who would take a sabbatical to go somewhere and study or do other work? A sabbatical means, hey, I'm not going to work anymore. I'm taking off from my regular duties to do something else. And that it's related to ceasing from work, which God did on the seventh day. His work was accomplished. And so that's Sabbath. In Mark chapter 2, we have an occasion where Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees. And we don't see any place in the New Testament, at least I don't know of any, where it says that we should always worship on Saturday. It doesn't say that. And that makes my understanding of the Ten Commandments, you know, God gave us commandments for a reason, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, commit adultery, those kinds of things. Those things are still in play. Jonathan? Right. And for some period of time, the Jewish church, the new Christians, they would still go to the temple. They would still perhaps go to the synagogues on Saturday, but they worshiped the Lord on Sunday because of the pattern that has been set up by his resurrection and so forth. So in Mark chapter 2, Jesus gets confronted. We're going to read verse 23 down to 28. And it begins, it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day. Now, I don't know if we need to say it here, but you know, when we talk about corn, it's talking about the grain. Corn to us is what used to be called maize, I think, the ears of corn. But this is like picking up some oats or some wheat and rubbing the head of the stalk in your hand and getting the kernels. And they went through anyway, they plucked the corn on the Sabbath day, and his disciples, as they went, they began to pluck the ears of corn. And the Pharisees, they said unto him, behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? What were they doing that was not lawful to them? They were harvesting. they were working. This is how the Jewish religion became very man-connected, because you know, people would interpret what God meant and they would add to it and build on it. You know, just like today, if somebody says something outrageous, somebody else will try to build on it and do even more. Verse 25. And Jesus, he said unto them, have you never read what David did? Have you not read the Bible, guys? He said, have you never read what David did when he had need and he was a-hungered, he and they that were with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, whatever, the high priest. He did eat the showbread. It's not lawful for him to eat. It's only for the priests. But he ate it, and he gave also to them that were with him. And he said unto them, Jesus is what Jesus says. He said, the Sabbath was not made for man. I'm sorry, the Sabbath was made for man. Man was not made for the Sabbath. So what's more important? What's important is mankind, not the ceremonial worship of a day. It's not important. Verse 28 says, "Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath." Very important information here. Sabbath. What did Jesus get in trouble with the Pharisees all the time for doing on the Sabbath? He was healing people, raising people from the dead, casting out demons, and the Pharisees, the elders in the synagogues, would say, "Do all your work, do your work on any day, but not the Sabbath." And he rebuked them. Because snacking on something you eat. What about walking through somebody's field and taking some grain and eating it? Does that sound like would that be frowned on today? If my neighbor has corn in his field, can I just go over there and get some corn? There is a purpose. I'm going to jump back to Deuteronomy 23 and read verse 24 and 25. This relates to what Jesus and his disciples were doing. They were walking through a stand of grain, and it wasn't their grain, it was somebody else's, but they were snacking on it. And in Deuteronomy, Moses says, when thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat grapes at thy fill at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in thy vessel. So it's if you're on a trip and you're hungry and you see somebody's got some food growing along the road, it wasn't improper to satisfy your appetite at the time. It says you can take some of it, but when you come into the standing corn of your neighbor, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thy hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle into thy neighbor's standing corn. You can't go out there and harvest it. But a traveler or a person who was out of work and was hungry, the Israelites were told not to harvest all the way to the corners of their property. Leave it for the poor, for the indigent, for people like Ruth who could go out and collect grain. So this is what Jesus and his disciples were doing. This commandment says you could go to the buffet restaurant. You just can't take a doggy bag home with you. You can't take extra. You're allowed. Yep. Right. It's yes. They didn't care. Yeah, Elizabeth just shared that they had an orange field, orange grove near where they lived when they were children, and the neighbors allowed them to go get an orange once in a while, not to just go over and fill the refrigerator with it, or take it to sell to someone else. It was personal, and that's neat. That's sort of the welfare program of the Old Testament, really, is food that was available. And a person who is poor is not made fun of or diminished by being able to go out and get what he needed at the time. It wasn't standing on the street corner like they do today. So, in Mark, the Pharisees are acting on rules not in Scripture, but in rules that their elders, their ancestors, the ancient rabbis had concocted, really, what was not done on a Sabbath day. So, excuse me. I remember hearing in Bible school when Sherry and I were there that if you had a splinter in your finger on the Sabbath day, you weren't allowed to take it out because that would be working. You're pulling lumber out of your finger. I mean, it's that severe because it doesn't make sense anyway, right? Jesus healed on the Sabbath day. The elders that he was under, or that were in office at his time, they weren't that concerned about people. They were more concerned about the calendar, and that's not what God wanted to. Let's go back to, yes, exactly. Go back to Mark 2:27. Jesus said to the Pharisees who were rebuking him, "The Sabbath was not made for man." I read that wrong. The Sabbath was made, it means it's for our benefit, not man for the Sabbath. We don't bow to some silly or unsafe or unnecessary routine just because it's the Sabbath day. The Sabbath was made for what purpose? We need to rest one day a week. If you try to work, and there are people who have to do it for an amount of time, and it takes a toll when you don't get a weekly rest, when you don't get a time to leave your work behind for a while. It's a day off. It's for physical benefit. It's for mental benefit. And it is a day of worship. It's holy to the Lord. But I remember when, one of the stories, I didn't look it up, but Jesus was healing someone, and he was rebuked. And he says, you're a hypocrite. If your ox fell in a ditch on the Sabbath day, you're going to pull it out. You know, be real. So what are you going to do? Sunday became the Lord's Day in the early church history. When Paul, it really became almost what you call official when Paul was going to the Gentiles, and the church at that time had, like I said before, the Jewish believers in Christ, they enjoyed going to the temple. They enjoyed the worship. They enjoyed what they participated in, but their worship began to be Lord's Day. Can we turn to Revelation chapter 1, verse 10? We don't see this word used a lot in the New Testament, but this is the writing of John, who was on the Isle of Patmos, and we believe it was in the mid-90s, like the year 96. And John, as he wrote, says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day." Not the Sabbath, it was the Lord's day. And so that phrase, you'll see it in a few places in the New Testament, but it was accepted early on that the Sunday was the day that the Christian church would worship. There's some commentaries that would say, or commenters who would say that historically Constantine put it into place in the church in the 300s, but it was practiced from early days. We can see by this. God knows we need a pattern away from work, and so it was demonstrated by God right from the time of creation. It was a pattern set, not just for a holy purpose, but for mankind. It's for our benefit. In Romans chapter 14, I want to look at a couple verses here, because as the apostles were spreading the gospel, there were those in their midst who had been raised Jewish, and to them the day was important. It was they felt obligated to the day of the Sabbath on Saturday. And if we look at this chapter, Paul talks about several things, and he starts the discussion this way. If someone is weak in their faith, they're new Christians, they may not have a lot of maturity. Him that's weak in the faith, receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. There's certain things we shouldn't argue about or make a big point of. And we jump down to verses 5 and 6. And he says, you can have one man who esteems one day above another. whether that's Saturday or Sunday. There's someone else who esteems every day alike. We live for the Lord every day. Do you ever work with people or know people who they were Christians on Sunday, and when they were at work, it was a different leadership, a different honor system. I particularly had a guy who he was more union-centered at work than I was, because Jesus told us how we should behave at work. It always bothered me that DP&L wrote my check. I worked for them. That was my contract. Some union saying, well, let's get together and let's refuse to do this, or let's not work hard, or, No, I don't work for the union. I work for the boss. So that was the kind of thing that I always lived by. So one man esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. It goes on in verse 6 and says, he that is regarding a day, if he sets a day aside, he's doing it for the Lord, right? But he that doesn't regard a day, say, if I say all days belong to the Lord, then Saturday or Sunday is no more important than the others. So he that doesn't regardeth not that particular day, it's to the Lord that he doesn't regard it. He that eateth, and this, what was the eating of meat? There was a possibility that it had been sacrificed to an idol, There was all question about whether you eat or not meat. He that eateth is eating to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. But if a person doesn't eat, he's doing it because he's doing it for the Lord in his own heart and his mind and conscience. So these are things that Paul said it's not worth arguing over. A couple more things. Deuteronomy 5:15. We read in Exodus this commandment, but in Deuteronomy 5, it adds a different, Moses adds here a different connotation to Sabbath worship. In verse 15. As he gave the Sabbath worship commandment, as it's recorded in Deuteronomy, Moses adds this. I want you to remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt. The Lord thy God brought thee out from there with a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore, the Lord thy God commandeth thee to keep the Sabbath day. Sabbath day is tied to the Exodus. We don't believe that there was any Sabbath day before this commandment, except it's mentioned one time earlier, and it's in Exodus chapter 16, verse 21 to 26. Exodus chapter 16, this is a period of time, a month to 2 months before the Ten Commandments were given. It was fresh in the Exodus from Egypt, and the people needed food, right? So God says, okay, I'll give you food. You'll get it 6 days a week. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating. When the sun waxed hot, it melted. And it came to pass, on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much. Now, if you gathered a lot on Monday, and you didn't go out and gather on Tuesday, your manna would rot. It would spoil. It would stink. But it says, it came to pass on the 6th day, they could gather twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said unto them, this is that which the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you bake today, seethe that which you will seethe, that which remaineth over, lay up for you to be kept until the morning. They laid it up until the morning as Moses bade, and it did not stink. It didn't rot. Neither were there worms therein. It happened any other day except for this on the 6th day, keeping it for the 7th. Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field. And we're going to finish with verse 26. 6 days shall you gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, the time of ceasing from work, in it there shall be none. That's the first time Sabbath is mentioned, is in this chapter. I wanted to close with a list. I looked up Jewish worship today on the Sabbath. What are they not allowed to do? Oh, we saw what the Pharisees thought in Jesus' day, but there are 5 specific areas. Number 1, no electronics. No TV, no computer, no phone on the Sabbath. You don't even turn your lights on or off because that's working. You're working a switch. Number 2, food. You cannot cook. You cannot heat food on the Sabbath. You can't heat it.